It's the EP Podcast. Evergreen Park.
Sitting down here at the 9-foot homemade oak bar, what a treat. It's not often that we get a U.S. congressman down here. We've had some that were running for office, but they lost. So this is our first winner. Sean Casten's here. How are you?
I'm doing well. Always a pleasure to be in somebody's random basement.
How much convincing does it take for somebody to come to you and say, look, I know that you're in one of the higher seats in government. You're one of the few that are pushing national things and making massive decisions. But there's a guy in Evergreen Park who's got a podcast in his basement. And they'd like you to come on and talk a little bit about Evergreen Park. Like, that had to take a little convincing.
Well, honestly, as we said before we went on the air here, when Kelly Burke recommended, that was all it took. Kelly's a wonderful person, great mayor in Evergreen Park, and that was the reference check we needed.
Yeah, she's the best. So I was thinking about, well, what can I ask you about that's Evergreen Park centric? And there are a few things that it probably takes the weight of a congressman. It probably takes the weight of a U.S. representative, somebody who's got a little bit more on the federal level to deal with some of the stuff that people complain about all the time here in Evergreen Park. And one of the big things they all complain about is they complain about the trains. They complain about the fact that, like, we have a train that runs right through the center of the village. It runs right next to the police station. It cuts off the fire station from one side to the other. It crisscrosses, so it goes across 95th and it goes across Kedzie about 200 feet from the intersection of 95th and Kedzie. So it can literally take the entire village and bring it to a standstill. And it's something that you see on social media here in Evergreen. There's Facebook pages. I'm sure you stay off of those things because they will get crazy, but people get on, they voice that they're upset. And it's one of the big complaints. Now, I worked Cook County 911. I was telling you that. And for a while, we were dispatching Metro police as part of the police stations we were doing. So I learned a lot about trains, and I understand it is very difficult to get trains and the companies that run, especially these freight lines, to make any changes whatsoever. What has that been like so far? Because I know it's a complaint you've heard, and I know it's something you're working on.
So a little bit of background. So I grew up on the East Coast, moved to Chicago in 2007. Most of what I knew about Chicago before I came out here was from the Blues Brothers. and I feel like every time I'm around, I always think of that scene where I said, do the trains come by often? So often you hardly notice them. and that's like, our ability to do things at the federal level. Yes, we've steered, money into rail grade separations and, up in Barrington, we got a project in Glen Ellen right now, and we can steer money around like that. But a lot of the big is sort of looking at the big sort of what's going on overall nationally. And I think people know this. It always surprises me when I'm back home. Chicago is the third biggest intermodal hub in the world. The number one is Singapore. The number two is Hong Kong. Number three is Chicago. So the other two you might notice are islands on the ocean where huge amounts of container ships are coming in. In Chicago, it's all coming in. And so it's not just the rail, but all the trucks that are coming in and pulling this through. I had, when we were working on the infrastructure bill, I met with Secretary Buttigieg, and I sort of joked with him. I said, you get these meetings with every member of Congress, and they all tell you that their district is the most important district in the country for infrastructure investments. And I have good news. I'm the only one who's not lying to you.
I mean, it's
because
true.
Like if you don't debottleneck the rail in Chicago, you can't move goods around the country. And the city was built on rail, but we've not kept up on the infrastructure side. And so, yes, we can work on things, we can lean on people, we can try to use whatever our bully pulpit is. But at the end of the day, we just got to get money into infrastructure. And so, in that infrastructure bill, I think there's, if my memory is right, about $60 billion that's specifically targeted to Illinois. There's another $16 billion that can go through. You're seeing some of those dollars start to flow with the CREATE project, some of the money around Metro. I think about $11 billion of that has flowed so far. If I'm really honest, that's probably nowhere near enough. Like, I still don't think Illinois is getting as much. We're getting our fair share as a state.
I think that
in terms of our contribution to like rail, and that infrastructure, I think we should be getting a lot more of that. But be careful what you wish for, right? St. Louis doesn't have a problem with rail. they also don't have a lot of people who live in St. Louis anymore.
Right. Exactly. Well,
Right?
the thing is, like, I hear those numbers, and as somebody who's a voter and somebody kind of pays attention to everything going on, I go, okay, well, yeah, I always hear these big numbers, but how much of it actually gets to where it needs to go? Like, how do you make sure that it's making a real impact? Because, like, there's two things that I think of right away when I think of the rail problem. I think, one, there's got to be a little bit better communication or even penalty to the companies. I know that they make the country run. I know they're important, but there's got to be something that says, hey, you can't park the train for an hour in the middle of the South Side. And it's not just Evergreen, it's everywhere. So somebody's got to come down a little bit on it. But two, you have so many technological advancements. I have a 9-year-old who loves trains. He goes on Prime and he shows me like all the newest trains around the world that move quicker, can stop and start quicker so they can get through an area quicker. Is that the kind of thing that we're going to see these billions of dollars spent on? Is there going to be what kind of change has been discussed that might actually make things run smoother?
Well, so I think a part of what we need is, we've got, and you had alluded to this in the trains, we built the railroad system in America 150 years ago by giving railroad companies monopoly rights on that train ride. And we've never really undone that. You probably know this, but I think it's worth reminding when you ride the Metro and you say, I'm on the BNSF line or I'm on the UP line, there's a reason why that's the name of the railroad.
Right, because it's theirs. They own it.
Because they own it,
yeah.
And they are the ones, Amtrak has to ask them for permission to use their track. Metro, and I'm overstating a little bit. There's coordination. There are groups that tie these things together. But there's no equivalent of like the Federal Highway Department who is deciding who can use the roads and how they use it. They're owned by the rail yards. And so ultimately, like, I think what we have to do to fix that is we really need to build more rail. We've got to deal with some NIMBY issues. I think particularly here in like on the south side of Cook, there's a lot less, because, I represent DuPage and Southwest Cook. There's a lot less flexible rail down in Southwest Cook than there is in DuPage. So in DuPage, where I live in Downers Grove, there's trains, during rush hour every 20, 30 minutes coming downtown.
Yeah.
If you're in Oak Lawn, you might be waiting an hour.
The Oak Lawn stop gets one Metro at a time, but that's because the freight lines need so much room.
Well, it's a little bit twofold. Number one, there's a lot of freight. We got plenty of freight going out on that BNSF line through Downers Grove as well. But that community was built out not necessarily around the rail as a commuter resource. It was built out around the rail as a freight nuisance. So it's hard to, like, you've now got like people living and commuting, and it's not very conducive to get it on the rail line. So we're trying to build new high-speed corridors that are dedicated to passenger rail. I think the high-profile ones are on the East Coast. There's talk of doing a Chicago to St. Louis one. Those are big long-term projects. But Daniel Burnham, make no small plans, right?
There you go.
Right?
There you go.
But as long as we're sharing that one track with the freight system, with the Metro system, with Amtrak, no one's going to be happy. And I would add, combined to that, the belt yard, just up here, it comes through Bedford Park in that area. I think the numbers are 30% of all freight rail cars in America spend at least 24 hours of every year in that yard. So there is no such thing as a freight car that isn't at some point assembled and disassembled in that yard. Well, that's those big long ones that come through, right? And so now how do you get that through? Because once that train gets clearance to move, you probably don't want it moving through at 50 miles an hour.
Right, and it takes a while for it to ramp up and slow down.
Now you're stopped for a long time. And so now how do we make sure that we're getting things, like that 75th Street overpass project, like some of the underpasses and overpasses? How do you make sure that emergency vehicles can still get through if there's a train going through that's going to take 10 minutes? And I don't think there's any Southsider who hasn't been stuck too long behind a train. But that just takes investments in tunnels and underpass, all those rail grade separations.
I know. And it's a lot. And you sit there and you talk about it like you give those big numbers, and then you sit there and think to yourself, how much would it really cost to be able to implement something like that in a dense area like Evergreen? You need a lot more money, and it'd be a pretty big project. So
a lot of eminent domain.
Yeah,
money alone may not be sufficient.
So let's talk about the post office too, because now that to me is really interesting. Evergreen Park gets a lot of complaints about their post office. But then every time I bring it up, somebody will be like, yeah, but that Mount Greenwood one. Like, everybody's mad about all the post office, I think. I think there's problems at all of them. And I wonder whether or not it's because in this era, there's far less mail actually being sent. Like, nobody writes letters to each other anymore, right? Like, when I was a kid, like, I sat down and I actually learned at St. Denis Grammar School. Like, this is how you write a letter. This is how you address a letter. This is how you send things to somebody. Now, most of it's being used for shipping. You got private companies like UPS and FedEx and everybody doing all this massive shipping. You would think it'd be easier on the post office. So is the problem that the post office isn't getting used as much and therefore it's a staffing issue? What do you see as the problem when people see things like really weird things where we have to bring in postal employees from other areas? They have to, during surge times, they're actually offering money, I want to say, about a year or so ago, where somebody would come in and live in Chicago just so they could actually help hand out things in certain areas. Is it a staffing thing because the post office doesn't get used the same way, or is it something else?
So I think in 2021, we looked at all of our calls to the office, and 50% of all the calls that came in were about postal delays. So suffice to say, yes, it's a thing, and not just Evergreen Park, not just about Greenwood, all over. And it's really nationwide. So we started digging into it. The first is that in terms of volume, the post office is actually as busy as they've ever been. Yes, you stopped writing letters, but you started sending lots of weird sized packages. People who, I want to get a pair of shoes, and why buy just one pair of shoes? Let me buy 10 pairs and return the 9 I don't like, right? All the internet shopping online and everything that did. And even if you're getting that with UPS or FedEx, a lot of those use the post office for the last mile because the post office is set up and has that infrastructure. But that's hugely changed the logistics of what the post office has to do, because it's one thing to have a sorting facility that's getting mostly, things the size of letter-shaped envelopes that can quickly be sorted. Something else when there's a bike box, there's a shoe box, there's, something fragile this end up, there's a refrigerator, and then there's some other mail, and how they sort that all through. We had we pulled together a field hearing with Senator Durbin in downtown Chicago. And the only positive thing I can say about that field hearing is we had a survey of the post office standards around the country, and Baltimore's worse. Chicago was not.
That's right. We're not the worst. That's what we're hanging our hat on.
My personal, I can't totally prove this, but I put a lot of this on Louis DeJoy. That when he came in, he's got some conflicts of interest. He has a lot of economic commitments to a private logistics firm. But when he came in, he started shuffling around a lot of the responsibilities. And so when you talk to the postal workers, these people are working long hours, right? And he was saying, well, you don't have resources, so we're going to have to cut delivery times. We're not going to hire people as much. We're going to limit the time at the processing center. And, as we need to keep reminding people, it's not called the U.S. Postal Business. It's called the U.S. Postal Service, right? And we got to make sure it delivers. We fixed part of that in the last Congress. There was this weird accounting thing that the post office, uniquely among federal agencies, was required to set aside all money for all of their long-term pensions before they could free up any cash. It'd be like you saying, I'm not going to pay my rent until I've covered my retirement.
Right.
Right. And it was just an accounting problem. They had cash there. And so we passed a bill. We got that law changed to free up some cash so the post office could spend it. There still have been issues with the Postal Service shutting down some of the processing facilities. And so, part of the reason why you'll see, boy, this neighborhood seems fine, this neighborhood is not so good. In some cases, it's because they've shut down a processing facility that was serving that area. And so now the letter carrier who used to have a 15-minute drive to the processing center from his house and then would go do his route and come back home, or her route, now has to drive an hour to the processing center because that's not there. They're still working the same amount. So now you got mail piling up, right? The Postal Service is an independent agency. And so until it's at the discretion of the Postal Board of Governors whether to fire DeJoy, retain DeJoy, put him on a workout plan, whatever they want to do. And that Board of Governors has been understaffed for a long time. So a lot of what we've pushed has just been saying, get that board fully staffed. They currently have, I believe, 7 of the 9 slots filled. Biden just nominated Marty Walsh, the former Secretary of Labor, Good Boston guy with a good thick Boston accent, who I think is actually also, I think he's like a commissioner of the NHL right now.
Okay.
Really, really nice guy. They've just nominated him to be on that board. There's still one more slot the Senate has to confirm. Not going to be my call whether or not DeJoy stays, but I think there's an accountability there that if you're the head of an organization and the organization is seeing declining service standards, you got to have some accountability.
I've been thinking the word accountability for the last 3 minutes while you've been talking, because I think that it's not only even at that level, but even all the way down, and that's how it is in any business, right? If there's not accountability up high, then there's no accountability down low. I mean, perfect example in Evergreen, and I laugh about it with Frank Murray, who's the library director. He'll send out every quarter like a mailer that has all the library programs. And the joke that we have is that he'll come over here to record his once a month thing on the EP podcast, and he'll be like, "Did you get the mailer?" And I'll either say no, or I'll tell him I got 20 of them. Because somebody's like, "I just got to get rid of these things," and just shoves them all into, and then I know they complain, but like, that's the thing. There's got to be somewhere in there where there's structure. In any business you see that. Anytime you see something failing, is because from the top on down, nobody's turning around and saying, "You got to do your job or you're out." There's no accountability. And I think that's probably the number one thing. It's the problem with the White Sox right now, Sean. There's no accountability. Jerry Reinsdorf is just sitting up there saying, "I want to win," and they just never win. He doesn't spend any money. He doesn't hire the right people. It's an accountability thing, I would think.
Well, maybe the analogy would be like, I'd rather blame Reinsdorf than blame the second baseman.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Certainly my experience is that, like, the letter carriers, the folks who work in the offices are good people, but if you had to drive twice as far to get the mail, if all of a sudden the sorting machine that you needed to get an upgrade because it's handling different size materials isn't getting a budget for an upgrade, these are the folks on the front lines who you're going to blame. But my experience with the actual rank and file folks is they're doing the best they can with what they've got, but we need to get them more resources to make sure that they can do their job in a pretty dynamic and changing mail delivery system.
How quick would that happen? I mean, you said you have two board things. This guy might need to be removed. Like, how quick does that happen? Because I think that's the thing. I think anybody when I talk to locally, anytime you hear somebody complain about anything, everybody just goes, "Well, it just moves so slow." Right? Like, everything seems, I know it's a big machine, right? And you're in there doing what you can for your constituents on a federal level, right? But you must get there and be like, "Wow, this is crazy. I have so many congressmen in so many different areas. Everybody's got a different idea. And by the time you convince everybody that you want to move in a direction, an election happens, you got to start convincing new people, and moving things and getting things done seems to take a long time."
Well, I guess democracy is slow and messy, but the independent agencies shouldn't necessarily be slow and messy, right? I mean, I don't think people were complaining about the post office 4 years ago. And, to be clear, I think it's much easier to break things than to build them. And a lot of what we've been doing while DeJoy's in there is just saying, like, no, let's up the pressure. So we just did a press conference with a bunch of members of the Illinois delegation a couple of weeks ago outside a building where DeJoy was speaking. It was, a little bit revolutionary, I suppose, but we knew he'd be there, and we knew the cameras would be there, to say you cannot shut down these sorting facilities, because if you shut them down, it'll take a long time to rebuild them, right? So, and thankfully we got a couple of them stopped. I know he's still talking about shutting down one down in, I want to say Springfield. There's not one close to here, but there still is some talk about other Illinois sorting facilities coming down. But as long as we keep them from breaking things, then I think getting good leadership in can move pretty quickly.
All right, one more question for you, if you don't mind me throwing in there. So, and you may not have any background in this. So if you're like, well, this is not something a congressman handles, you just go ahead and tell me this. But it struck me as we were sitting here talking, I don't even know why it's a hot button issue, but it's a hot button issue that Evergreen Park is considering the idea of joining all the other suburbs that all have a dispensary in Evergreen Park. Have you heard in your other districts how those things work? Have you heard anything about them? Have you gotten a sense they're good, they're bad, you're indifferent to them? Because you cover a big, giant area. And I think when something happens locally, people just kind of look at what's happening on their own front porch, and they don't really know how has that been going in all the other parts of your district.
So I'm going to take no position, positive or negative, but I can tell you a little bit about what's happened. So since marijuana was legalized in Illinois, a lot of those rules on zoning were down to the towns and whether your town has home rule and all the rest of those nuances. I think every town has been a little bit different on it. And, maybe the right answer is this is just democracy in action. What what the voters in Evergreen Park want is the right thing to do. I've seen some towns that have said we just don't want to have this in our town. We don't want this sort of storefront, among the other storefronts. You've seen some other towns who have said this is a huge amount of tax revenue and we want to bring it in here. And you've had some that have flipped from one back to the other over the course of town. I say this not as a recommender, but as a voter. I feel like it's a lot like gambling, right? If you put gambling in your bar, you're probably going to get more traffic at the bar. It's also, if you decide that you didn't like that, it's really hard to go backwards on that.
So you want to be sure.
Once that genie's out of the bottle, it's going to be there. And, and I do have some concerns that a lot of these have sort of preyed on the people with the least information about the decision, right? We've never really, and I'm fully in favor of marijuana legalization. Don't take this the wrong way. But we basically did legalization without decriminalization. So it still is a scheduled narcotic at the federal level, which means that you still can't actually do research on what the impacts are of marijuana. So we've sort of stapled in these rules that says, well, we're going to basically assume that people who, that the alcohol age limits kind of map to this. You're not going to be able to go backwards if the research turns out to be, well, maybe there's a different set of criteria that we should apply to this. Maybe you shouldn't take it with certain drugs. Maybe it's good. We've just never done the research.
Right.
And then meanwhile,
maybe you can make it into a shirt like Woody Harrelson. I mean, exactly.
And then meanwhile, we've still got folks in federal prison who have no shot of getting out anytime soon for doing things that, had they done them 2 years later, would have been fine. And so you've got a lot of the cannabis growers and dispensaries where the people who most know how to do this and do it right are not able to work, right? In some cases, they're locked away because we never really sort of coupled the whole criminal justice reforms with all this. And the states sort of got out in front of it. So, and I don't want to sound like I'm leaning one way or the other, but right. I just think like as you or folks in Evergreen Park are voting about this, just think carefully about like, once that genie's out of the bottle, what do you do?
I think that's why it's interesting because Mayor Burke was in here and she was talking about all the steps of the research. Like they are still in the look into it to the point where she mentioned that she and some of the other trustees have been sitting in parking lots watching what happens inside. Like they're really like, we don't want to do this until we're sure that we think it makes sense. So I think that kind of falls in line to what you're kind of explaining here. Like, that if you do something like this, it's a genie out of the bottle. And so you want to make sure. So that makes a lot of sense to me.
I'll just share a funny story with you. When I was first running back in 2018, I was walking around to the train stations getting signatures to be on the ballot. And I had almost this exact conversation with this guy. And so I walked through all, everything that we just said. And he looks at me and he says, all right, I'll sign your petition. And I said, all right, great. And I pull out the paper, give him the clipboard, and he goes, let me just pack my bowl first.
That's awesome. That's amazing. Sean Casten is your U.S. congressman, and he covers a large area, but Evergreen Park is in the middle of it, and we were fortunate enough that he stopped by and hung out in a basement. I appreciate that. What a journey. Born in Ireland, lived on the East Coast, comes here, congressman, and now he ended up in my basement. Kind of a low point.
All of it was so that I could end up here.
There you go. It was all, you were always on a path, Sean. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris.
It's the EP Podcast. All things Evergreen Park. It's the EP Podcast. Evergreen Park.